Welcome to the Amphigory Effect podcast with your host, Zach Brackett, and your co-host, Justin Marlowe. Let's begin.
Hello everybody and welcome to the Amphigory Effect podcast. My name is Zach Brackett and sitting across from me is Justin. Justin, say hello to the world.
Hello world!
Justin, what are we talking about today?
Today we're talking about the Myers-Briggs Personality Test, and we're also going to discuss personality itself a little bit.
Oh, that sounds awesome. Well, I'll start out with talking a little bit about Myers-Briggs itself because we kind of have to understand it to be able to talk about it. And so some of you psychology people out there, bear with me. I'm probably going to slaughter some of this because I am not a psychologist, but I'll give it my best shot. So a quick history of MBTI, as it's called. It was created by Isabel Myers and her daughter, Catherine Briggs. They analyzed the works of Charles Jung, founder of analytical psychology. She focused on making information accessible and understandable and kind of translating Jung's work in a manner of speaking. The four main points are seen in all individuals, so it's not something that's just black and white. Everybody has a little bit of something of all these sources. She defined the categories as superior and inferior functions. So how you act, you'll have one area that's inferior, not meaning bad, but that you don't act on as much.
So it's kind of like a spectrum rather than
exactly.
Like a binary.
Yeah. You'll have a little bit of everything in your personality. There's no one that is completely never acts introverted ever. You know, they usually show signs of it depends on the situation, stuff like that. And she created a universal scale to determine these functions and named them and all that good stuff. So, Justin, will you give us the first term we're going to learn about the Myers-Briggs, the first two categories that we could be in?
Yeah, the first one is actually pretty interesting. It's introversion versus extroversion. So it's they kind of define it in the Myers-Briggs terms as where your energy comes from. Introverts will tend to sort of feel refreshed and re-energized by being alone, spending time alone in their own thoughts. And extroverts are the opposite, so they'll sort of feel more at home, be refreshed in crowds, and when they're alone is when they start to feel anxious.
Right. So another thing to point out again is that I feel like sometimes I'm an extrovert and sometimes I'm an introvert. Like there's some days where I'm just like, I don't want to talk to anybody. I just want to go home and I want to play my games and read my books, and I don't want to have anything to do with anyone. But I feel like most of the time I'm pretty extroverted, pretty outgoing. So yeah, that's a really interesting one. I'm interested in talk a little bit more about that. We're going to go to the second one, and again, there's four of these. The second one is intuitive versus sensing. So intuitive, you speak more figuratively. You focus on big ideas, big dreams, thoughts that kind of sporadic. Your thoughts might leap from subject to subject, and typically you're more creative this way. Sensing is you're very literal. I believe this is probably you, Justin. I don't want to make assumptions before we actually get the results of the test, but just by this definition alone, it focuses on facts and details. So very factual person, and you would have all your thoughts in sequence to each other. So very organized. Typically, you'd probably be an organized, neat-ish person. What do you think, Justin? Does it kind of define you?
I definitely think it describes my thoughts, but maybe not any other aspect of my life.
Right. Well, that's
everybody's on the spectrum, right?
Yeah. That's the cool thing about this test is that we have this spectrum where you're like, oh yeah, I could totally see how I'm this way in this area, but this area, I don't. That's nuts. I'm never that way. So tell us about the third one, Justin.
Okay, the third is another interesting one. It kind of ties into the last. It's thinking versus feeling. So thinkers, again, are more logical, reasonable. They tend to question what they're told. They can be critical, whether that be critical of a thing or applying critical thinking to a situation. And they tend to be a little more resilient emotionally. Feelers are more empathetic, compassionate, more accommodating, nurturing, the sort of the caregiver stereotype.
Nice. All right. Well, I'll talk about the last one. Judging versus perceiving. Judging, you're more systematic, planful, early to rise type. scheduled, methodical. I think this kind of goes back to intuitive versus sensing. All these kind of seem to tie in with each other. I think that's probably the point. And so you have judging and then perceiving, which is more casual, open-ended, pressure prompted, so that peer pressure is going to get to you. More spontaneous and emergent. So you're not really going to be as planned. So you're more likely to go out for a drink at 3 a.m. without any, you're just like, well, I think I'm just going to go for a drink at 3. When a judging person will already have that planned out like a week in advance or something like that. So as we go on, it's important to understand that all 8 of these characteristics also work in combination with each other to create a temperament, as well as the way that we process our information. So like I just said, it kind of interweaves and makes each person a little bit different. And again, all these aspects, everyone will probably have a little bit of all these 8. So there'll be, like I said, days where you're just like, no, I don't want to talk to anybody. The test merely is just to indicate the scale of which you have a natural tendency toward. Most of these tests will show you the percentage of each category that you have. So if you're a thinker, it doesn't mean you can't ever feel, right? And if you are an introvert, you can still enjoy socializing. All right, well, we took the test. And Justin, tell us about your results.
Well, it wasn't too different than I expected, honestly. I ended up as I believe it was an ISTJ, which means I'm introverted naturally. I actually scored very high on introversion.
What was your percentage?
It was about 90% on the particular test that I took. Yeah,
introverted. Wow. Yeah.
How about you, Zach? How did you score on introversion versus extroversion?
I was actually an extrovert, which I kind of saw coming. I'm pretty outgoing, and I like to talk to people. I was 85% extroverted on this test. And just for the record, we took the same exact test, all 3 of us. Wesley took it as well. So yeah, we are getting the same information from the same test. Now, every test except the actual official Myers-Briggs, which is forever long and actually costs money to take, you might get a little bit different because they might phrase their questions differently or something like that. But normally you would get the same results. It doesn't matter how many tests you took. So I was extroverted, you were introverted, and Wesley was introverted by only 55% to 45%. So he's really close.
Yeah, Wesley's results in particular I think are interesting because if you knew Wesley, it seems strange to be sort of riding the line, but it suits him perfectly.
Right, exactly. And by the way, I should mention that Wesley is our sound guy producer, and that is why you don't hear his voice ever.
But you can feel his stares if you listen carefully.
And the cue cards are real. We'll get those quite a bit during this show. Okay, so let's go on to the next one. This is the intuitive versus sensing. Justin, how'd you score on that one?
Almost as bad as the last one, actually. I got 85% on the observant or sensing side.
Oh, okay. So you were more intuitive? Is that correct?
No, I was more observant, actually.
Oh,
yeah.
Okay. So you kind of see the world literally. That's the one I figured you would be.
And it's interesting because I think I've scored differently on the spectrum before in the past. But as I've gotten older, my sort of outlook on the world has shifted in that direction.
You got cynical in your old age?
Yeah, so, I mean, if you want to say it that way, I mean, that's truth. And, yeah, it's actually reflected in my results. So I thought that was pretty interesting.
I actually scored the opposite again. I was more intuitive or feeling, I think it is. Or hold on. Think intuitive. Yeah, intuitive, sorry. This speaks figuratively, so I like having big ideas. And I like thinking, let's do this big thing, and I'm less oriented on the details. And I think that's why it's so great to have you on the podcast, because I'm like, look at all this big stuff we can do, and you're kind of like, well,
actually the minutia is horrible. Yeah, we fix this for you.
we need to plan this out a little bit, when exactly we're going to do this and when exactly we're going to do that. So I think that's really cool.
Yeah, and I just want to say really quick before we move on to the next one, I think it's I think it fits you so well as a a creative writer and a podcast host. I mean, it just makes perfect sense that you'd be on the spectrum that way. So.
Right. Yeah. That's really cool. And then I'll talk about the next one, thinking versus feeling. And the reason I'm kind of struggling with the terminology is the test that we took. It defined it in Myers-Briggs terms at the top, but going through the rest of the test, it kind of made up its own wording. I don't know if they can't really use Myers-Briggs terminology, and so that's why I'm kind of like trying to jump back and forth and say, okay, well, this means this.
I
and
certainly
this means
hope that it's not a copyright sort of situation and something that's supposed to be scientific.
Yeah,
I would hope that that's not it.
Anyway, so we're going to go to the next one, which in Myers-Briggs terms is thinking versus feeling. And I was actually more feeling. I was 60% to 40%. So that's kind of a tight gap there. I think
Right.
I think that's actually pretty accurate because I think I am emotional most of the time, but I also feel I'm rational, and it kind of sucks to be both of those because I don't
play well with each other.
No, it makes for a very anxious person because you realize that you're acting emotionally as a thinker.
Rationally, but you can't.
It doesn't matter, right? Because emotions
right?
aren't rational at all. So I think that my feelings end up winning a little bit more than my thinking. What about you, Justin? How'd you do on that one?
No surprise. I ended up with 82% on the thinking side, which.
You heartless animal.
Yeah, I do get that a lot, and
Yeah.
honestly, sometimes I joke around about it sometimes, but if I were to be diagnosed as a sociopath someday, I wouldn't be that surprised, honestly.
So you have, I don't want to say it harshly, but you feel like you have like a lack of empathy sometimes?
I do. I honestly do. Yeah, there are times when I know that I give other people's plights less attention than other people would.
So do you realize that? Let's just say you offended someone, right? Would you realize that you offended them in the first place, or is it something that it doesn't even register? So is that lack of feeling saying, well, yeah, logically I know that probably offended them, but I don't care, or is it?
I think it's more of that. I think it's more of a situation where it's not that I'm incapable, it's that there's no utility in realizing that, so I don't spend a lot of effort on it.
Right, because
like with people that I'm already close with, it's a little different, obviously.
Well, people obviously get to know you and realize...
But I think even my close family members and stuff would say that I'm not the cuddliest teddy bear in the room.
Well, there's nothing wrong with that in itself. As long as you actually...
As long as I have a test to make an excuse for me, then I'm good to go.
All right, so that was thinking versus feeling. And now we're going to go on to the next one, which is the last one, judging versus perceiving. Justin, how'd you score on that one?
This was probably the one that I was closest to borderline. I was about 62% judging. Okay. And I think that makes sense for me.
I was actually 65% perceiving. So we are actually exactly the opposite all the way down.
That is crazy. I knew that we would have differences, but I certainly did not think it would be exactly opposite the whole way down.
Yeah, that's insane. When I took the test a few years ago, I was ENFJ. So and the judging and perceiving is still close. So I think that again in my old age I have changed a little bit, but that's really cool.
That is fascinating. I mean, wow. And I know you've had some personal changes that you have gone through in that time. So it's interesting how that's reflected in the test.
Exactly. Yeah, that's really cool. All right. So Wesley actually was introverted, which we talked about was a little bit surprising. Intuitive. He focuses on the big ideas. That is a little bit surprising to me too. Thinking, which was no surprise, and judging, which systematic. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I have to agree. Now that I think about it, Wesley being intuitive, that is a bit of a surprise. I think of him generally as more of a detail-oriented person, so that is interesting. And as far as introversion, extroversion, I could see that going either way.
Well, it was really close. It was 55-45.
Yeah, I do know that he's kind of like me in that he tends to open up to people after he gets to know them a little bit better,
maybe that's what we can take from that. If you have a close introvert extrovert, it usually could mean that you're very open with the people you're close to, but it takes you a little bit longer to kind of get to know people. You're not the first one to jump out there and say, hey.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as an anecdote to support this view of Wesley once told me that a guy that he did not know walked up to him, put his hand on his shoulder, and said, "Hey, buddy, how's it going?" And Wesley hated that guy from that point forward. That's the kind of guy Wesley is.
Because he didn't introduce himself?
Exactly.
Oh, man. We got to get Weslly on one of these shows for real.
We will.
So you guys, and then to talk a little bit more about people on our team, our writer, Mackenzie, she is an INFJ. So she's intuitive, introverted, which, if you know Mackenzie, yeah, she's definitely introverted. Feeling, and judging. That makes sense. And her, our editor, Joe, who they're actually dating right now, he is an ENFJ. So they're obviously like super close, except for the extroverted and introverted.
That's interesting. And actually Wesley's not that far off from them either.
Yeah.
And we
really cool.
We actually have a lot in common too. Zach, you're kind of the odd man out.
Yeah, I know, man. I feel so left out. Like I said, I was very surprised because when I took the test before, I was ENFJ, and I was studying to be a teacher, which was like the perfect personality type. I actually took it in an education class, and I was all pumped. I was like, yeah, I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing. And now that that was a couple of years ago, I've kind of grown up a little bit.
You understand the harsh realities of the world we live in.
The world slapped me around a little bit, and now I changed my personality. Okay, well, I think that's a good transition. So, do you think that you changed that drastically over time? Is this a part of becoming who you are? At what age, per se, would you say this is definitely your personality? Because you're obviously always changing, right?
I think you definitely are, and I think for that reason it doesn't make sense to stick an age number to it. I think that it appears to be an age because of the culture that we live in, and as you settle down in your later years after you're done having children and whatnot, things sort of settle into a routine. Mm-hmm. But I think that if for some reason you started some kind of major life change in your older age, you absolutely could still see a personality change.
Right. Well, I kind of want to talk a little bit about whether this test is viable. That's kind of the big discussion point of today. Whether we think that, first of all, is the test accurate, and secondly, does it even matter that it's accurate? I have an article here in front of me written by Mary H. McCulley. She's a psychologist and a former member of the Department of Clinical Psychology at the University of Florida. And she wrote an article that was very interesting that we read, and it kind of talked about the history a little bit like we did. But what interested me a lot was that this paragraph where she says, quote, "We can certainly argue that a self-report questionnaire cannot tap unconscious functions. Myers set herself the task of finding out if it was possible to create a way to let ordinary people identify themselves in terms of Jung's complex work. Part of her work was to refine the tool. The other part was to test hypotheses with the tool," unquote. So basically what she's saying there is that we can make the argument that because you're taking it yourself, your own biases get in the way. What do you think about that?
I mean, that makes sense, but at the same time, isn't your personality basically just a summation of your biases?
Right, but if I felt that I was more extroverted, right, and I wanted to portray myself as extroverted, even though I have maybe deep insecurities about talking to other people, and it's really hard for me, but I wanted to be that way, couldn't it be said that I could sway the test and answer the questions untruthfully, even subconsciously, subvert the results to get what I wanted out of it?
You do have to wonder at the point where you start to subconsciously alter the test results. I mean, isn't that sort of like a self-fulfilling prophecy? I mean, your thoughts inform your actions, and your actions inform the answers on the test, right?
Right.
You answer the test questions based on what you would do in that hypothetical situation. So if you believe deep down that you're extroverted,
you will become extroverted in a way.
I guess.
Well, I think that taps into the psyche too much for our current knowledge. You know, at some point you have to say, well, we just don't know yet.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think if there is a subconscious mind, if that really is even is a thing, then it has some kind of impact. But yeah, I mean, can you say how much?
Right, and I don't think we can can really right now. But let's talk a little bit more about how we become this way, right? So there are different ways that we can process things cognitively that impact our behavior, which would in turn impact our personalities in different ways. So this leads back to the nature versus nurture argument. And by the way, that'd be a fantastic episode to do one on eventually. So this nature versus nurture argument is the argument or whether we're genetically born with our personality types, or is it our environment that molds us and makes us this way. And me and Justin had a conversation before we started the show about how Myers-Briggs test kind of assumes that you were born with preferences, and so you already have these personality types embedded in your nature. So they, just for a short overview, they seem to take more on a nature side, but then I've seen some people that say, well, you begin with a little bit of this nature, but it's more your nurture that determines who you are at the end. So what do you think about that? That's a very interesting argument to me.
I think there's definitely an aspect of both, but I believe in the long term, the final answer is probably going to be nurture, and I think the fact that people's personalities can change so much over time is pretty much proof of that.
Right, and I think nurture is, I think we're going to find in the future that nurture has a lot more to do with your developing mind than we even give it credit for now. I think even as, and it obviously doesn't apply to everyone, but when you think of in terms of just religion geographically, different areas of the world tend to subscribe to different religions, and that usually is the case because they were raised that way. And so obviously not saying any religion is better than the other, but I think that a lot of stuff that you choose and maybe you follow through your whole life is determined when you're young and being raised and getting subjected to these ideas that your parents already have, who got them from their parents and their parents before, and stuff like that.
Yeah, I think that you can't really understate the impact that ideas have on a person. I mean,
especially at a young age.
Yeah, but even in general, I mean, a guy who's overweight his entire life and suddenly decides, you know what, I'm through with this, and he develops the sort of willpower that he's never had before to do all this exercise and change his diet. And I mean, that's an idea that's taken root in his head and changed his personality.
Right. So that's a very hard thing to argue because, again, it comes down to we just don't know some of this stuff. But do you think there will ever be a case where you think science will progress enough to where we can know?
I think it's practically an inevitability that someday we will understand the brain well enough to separate nature from nurture, but I don't think it's going to happen in our lifetimes.
Oh, absolutely not. But let's just say you have a basic knowledge of the sciences and how this would work. So just throw a hypothesis out there, and we're obviously not going to judge you for it, but what if you were going to say this is kind of how this would work? How do you think? Would you go into the brain and study the neurons in each specific person, or? I
mean, okay, let's get really out there because this is the kind of stuff I like, right? Let's get really out there. We're advanced enough. We understand the universe enough that we can create another universe that's exactly like our own, right? It has all the same rules. In that universe, we would understand the brain of any individual well enough to be able to predict, not just understand, what are their preferences as far as introversion, extroversion goes, but be able to predict their behavior, which is what something like Myers-Briggs really wants to do. That's the end game for science, right? Is to be able to make a prediction about something. So if we were able to do that, we would know exactly how nature versus nurture would interact. And there's no reason to believe that you couldn't eventually apply that to the real world if you could understand the brain well enough.
So you're diving into a little bit of physics here, right? Where
like
string
tiny
theory a little bit?
No.
Not multiple universes and all that?
I mean, well, this is kind of getting off topic, but what is the difference between an alternate universe and a perfect replica of our own?
Man, that's getting really deep.
Yeah, that's way off topic. I'm sorry, that maybe wasn't necessary to get into. But
No.
The point is, if you understand the brain well enough that you can predict a person's actions, right?
Right.
Minority Report style,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
with science instead of Scientology or whatever Tom Cruise is doing in that movie. If you could do that, then if you predicted a person to do a certain thing, and
You
you
could
knew
apply
that
it
the
to the
prediction was
real
right,
world,
and they didn't do that, then you'd know that it must have had something to do with their upbringing.
Right.
Right.
Well, if you're diving into that, I know again this is a little bit off topic, but again I think that's what Myers-Briggs wants to do. It wants to say, in this situation, you would do this.
Right. I think
because
that has to be the point of it, right? Because otherwise, what's the use
why
of knowing?
know your personality?
It's basically just like another
So
horoscope,
then
right?
you dive into the fact, well, if you can predict everything you're going to do you really even have a choice in the first place? Are you just a result of your...
Okay, see, now you are getting into physics, and I think you're doing it on purpose.
That's no, I'm not. But at the same time, I love that topic because...
I do too.
Again, it's one of those things that you can't really answer right now because we don't know.
Right, we don't.
But it's fascinating to think about.
Well, I'll give you... I'm gonna let's just go ahead and get into this because that's what I want to talk about anyway. Okay,
it's fine. Let's dive in.
I'm gonna give an argument in support of the fact that there is no such thing as free will, and I'm gonna let you do with that what you will.
Let
okay,
me try to defend it. Okay.
So let's go back to my scenario where far into the future, right?
We made this other universe.
We don't even need to do that. We'll just say we're in our universe. Although that's what you just said, that'll obviously have happened by this point. But let's just say we understand the universe perfectly, right?
So everything we know everything.
We can maybe we don't understand the Big Bang or whatever because that happened before, and maybe the rules of our universe weren't the same then. But we understand the rules in our universe now well enough that we can predict anything, right? So if I can predict what you're gonna do you have a choice?
I don't know, but and it gets into this whole thing where if you can predict what I'm gonna do, you'll act differently.
Would you?
That's the question,
because
isn't it?
Here's the thing, right? Not only did I predict what you were going to do, I was also able to predict that you would try and change your decision based on me knowing what you were going to do.
I think it just ends up being a huge circle, right? So if everyone understands everything, and let's just say this knowledge is accessible to the common man, not just scientists. So I would know that when I walked into work, so-and-so would say hello to me. Or I would say this in a conversation, and you would get offended. So I wouldn't say it unless I wanted to offend.
Okay.
You know what I mean?
The problem here is we're trying to apply this super science to our everyday lives, right?
Right.
You have to remember that linear time still exists.
Yeah.
You cannot change a choice that you made. Right, you cannot make a decision, then go back in time and be like, "Wait a minute, I don't want to do that because that didn't work out."
But if we knew how you're going to act.
Here's the physics backing for why this works. Okay,
and this is where I struggle with it.
Right, this is where you're getting confused. Now I can understand that because it is confusing. I mean, admittedly. So the idea is that if we can predict the universe well enough, right, that means we can predict all the random fluctuations of quarks and atoms and all that. So what that means is, if we can trace everything back to the Big Bang, then it's like throwing a bouncy ball at a wall, right? You throw the ball, and because you knew how hard you threw it and at what angle and what surface it's bouncing off of, and the frictional coefficient of that wall, you know exactly where that ball is going to go. And we could potentially do that for every particle in the universe, meaning that we know where that particle of carbon from the Big Bang is going to end up in a neuron in your brain. Wow. And when it's going to fire off. Now that's the backing,
end game, yeah,
right?
Okay, that makes sense. I have my mind has a problem.
Wesley is just going nuts over there right now. He hates this. He wants to talk so bad.
My mind has a problem wrapping around not trying to apply this to everyday life because that's kind of how my mind works. I want to see how this works.
Of course.
But again, tying it back to Myers-Briggs because that was a little bit of a stretch. I think that Myers-Briggs could be one of the founding fathers of this future idea that you're talking about that could be, because this is grouping people into personality types is the first way of knowing or predicting how they're going to act in the future.
I agree. I just think that it's from like a scientific standpoint looking back on Myers-Briggs in like 1,000 years, it's gonna be like,
well, it's gonna
we
be
were
like
just waving our arms around.
It's gonna be
in the
like
dark.
cavemen inventing fire,
right?
Yeah, exactly.
It's Scientology,
But isn't
Scientology, psychology? I mean, it just seems like it's still in such like an infantile stage. There's so much to learn. Like we just don't know anything.
Right. All right. So let's talk a little bit about is this test even useful, or how is it useful? Is probably a better way to discuss it. What do you think? Do you think this test is viable, or you can use it on an everyday level?
Well, I think we should start with you, since you said you took it when you were when you're still studying to become a teacher. So, how do you feel like that helped you? You said you were excited that you seemed to match with the preferred personality type.
Right, and so what we did was we all took the test in this class, and at the end they showed a chart of careers that you might have with this personality type, or careers that you would enjoy and succeed at based on your personality. And one of the ones was a teacher. The best compatibility was ENFJ, which I was at the time, or which I thought I was. And so I was. It's kind of like, it's fulfilling because you said, well, okay, I made the right choice. So I was basing my whole career path on an online test that I took myself.
So getting back to the bias then, because you were already in this class when you took the test, do you think that you may have pushed yourself in the direction to get that particular personality?
I think, I could have. Because it is kind of a circle, like you said before. Your biases affect your decisions, but isn't that part of your personality? But at the same time, it also goes back into self-perception. So I want to see myself this way. I want to see myself as extroverted and planned and all that, because in my mind, that's what an ideal person would be, maybe, or that's how I want others to see me.
Right. So I think that raises a great point. So does the test maybe sort of tell you what your ideal personality is rather than what your actual one is?
Wow.
And maybe that's how it accounts for not being able to test for the subconscious.
Wow, that's a really good point. And so you really maybe aren't getting your exact personality. Maybe you're getting what you think your personality should be.
That kind of changes my whole view on it. I was absolutely ready to take a huge dump on this, but now I kind of can see some merit to it.
Right.
It sort of
maybe it should
shows you a roadmap for where you want to be going.
Right, and maybe if you took it or judge your results in that light, instead of saying, this is what I am, or this is how I act, saying, well, this is how I think I should act, or maybe this is how I think I should act. Oh my goodness, yeah. So it goes into that, and I think you could use that in your everyday and say, I feel most fulfilled in my mind with my identity when I act this way, when I am extroverted and thoughtful.
I think this, looking at it in this way, which I just now cannot believe that I've never heard it put this way before.
Well, it probably has in some.
Yeah, I'm sure it has. It explains why we do seem to undergo personality changes, because the things that we value do change. It explains how we can account for that lack of being able to test the subconscious. I mean, it makes a lot of sense, and it does make the entire type indicator seem a lot more valuable to people.
Right, because it gives you an outlook on maybe where you're going instead of where you are right now. Maybe you can use this, as I said before, as a kind of, I think you said it, as a roadmap to maybe how you think you should act. And I think that anything that lets you do this introspection, like this deep diving into your mind, it is useful. I mean, I can't really argue the fact that it's never going to be useful to know more about yourself. And even if the results are total bunk, which they probably aren't, but let's just say for a second that they are, I think that diving in and answering those questions and thinking, well, how would I act in that situation, or how do I think, or how do I feel, I think that's helpful. And I don't think that it's tied just to the results. I think literally just taking the test helps you understand yourself a little bit better.
Yeah, I agree. I mean,
you don't sound like you're happy you agree.
Well, I think it raises another concern that I have now. I think that maybe, I mean, we could be totally off base on our
right,
analysis
absolutely.
of this.
We are
but
not psychologists in any means and never claim to be.
at the same time, if we do have a point, then I feel like not enough warning labels come attached to these tests.
Right.
You don't really get the sense that, yeah, you should probably take this every year or two to make sure that you're still where you think you are.
And I think the reason that is because, once again, this isn't used in everyday. This isn't really used by interviewers, really. Like, no one says, what's your personality type in an interview, as much as just kind of answering questions similar to what's on the test of how would you act in these situations.
Yeah, exactly. I'm now thinking that if someone were to ask you, hey, what is your memorized personality type, that actually just isn't as useful as sitting there and taking the test that day.
Right.
There's a distinct difference between those two
And I think
things.
it breaks the whole thing that Mary McCulley talked about in her article, which I forgot to mention the name, was Measurement and Evaluation in Counseling and Development. From the American Counseling Association. So that was what her article actually was in, and we'll put a link to the article in the show notes so you guys can read it for yourself, because it's pretty technical and it's kind of long, but it does give us an insight. But I think what she was talking about is it takes away that bias of yourself, because you're taking the test yourself and you're self-reporting these questions that are kind of vague on purpose. To let you kind of interpret them how you want, and you even spoke to before while we were taking the test how the circles that say neutral or strongly agree and maybe I agree a little bit, and you were asking how do I know how much I agree on something, and I think that kind of plays into all of this, but I think that this talk has been very useful because I feel like I understand it more, and I feel like I can go analyze it instead of just taking my results. But one more thing, in kind of closing, I want to talk about before we kind of recap and give another little bit that Mary McCulley talked about. Do you think this is maybe not such a great test because it kind of puts you into types? It kind of separates you from others. So, I mean, obviously me and you can kind of enjoy that we're opposite, right? Say, oh, cool, yeah, that's cool. But in that class that we took the test, he said everyone who is ENFJ raised their hand. And immediately you feel this connection to other people.
As well.
Exclusion, exactly. And so in a room, if I knew that so-and-so and so-and-so were ENFJ or whatever, and I know that's my type, or whatever my type is, would I be more susceptible to walking over to them and talking to them, becoming friends, maybe excluding others who I say, well, you're this type. You know, I don't think I get along with you as well.
I think your concern is valid, but I think that it's more of a marketing issue than an issue with the validity of the test. Imagine a world where the test is identical, but they don't divide it into little categories like INTJ. It just tells you, well, this is how you feel about something, this is how you act. By slapping an easy label on it, it's like putting a flag on it. It lets people plant their flags and argue about it.
And I think if everyone could do this kind of analysis of it, I think it'd be a healthier test. Because then you would know, okay, well, this isn't saying I'm this way all the time.
Treating it like a horoscope, I think, is exactly the wrong way to handle it.
Right, exactly. Well, I think part of my maybe concern of this is all of these dystopian novels where you take a test, obviously not Myers-Briggs, but something that
inspired by it,
right? Certainly, where you take a test and it says the type, and then you end up doing this type of job. And so you live in places where people do that same job, and it really separates and doesn't create a sense of unity as a nation or a world or whatever universe that the fiction is.
Right. I think that's the danger that you face when you apply any kind of scientific concept in a place where it doesn't fit. It's fine to use it not necessarily to assign jobs, because I obviously believe in that people have the freedom to choose what they want to do. But
go back to that free will thing.
Well,
see,
yeah. I mean, insofar as I have free will, I believe that I have the right to exercise it. But I don't know. I mean, there's no there's really no basis for separating people into neighborhoods based on their jobs.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, that's...
There isn't a basis for it now. And I think that you could take anything too far. And I think that going into Myers-Briggs, you and I encourage everyone to go and take this test. You can find it on multiple different sites on the internet and stuff like that. You could go and pay to take the actual Myers-Briggs test and get your official results. But if you're not that hardcore, we weren't. Mackenzie actually paid to take the big one, so she actually probably has more accurate results in that regard. But we took a simple one online, and we might even put a link to that in the show notes as well, where you guys can go and take it and tell us, send us emails about what you think, about what maybe this, were you what you thought you were going to be? Were you what you thought you were going to be? Were you surprised by your results, and how does this affect you moving forward? So kind of in closing, I wanted to talk about what Mary McCulley in her article says the Myers-Briggs states. So it says, number one, that we are born with preferences. And so that's kind of a topic you could argue in itself. It goes back to what we talked about a little bit, nature versus nurture. And secondly, she says our family and culture facilitate use and development of our preferences. So this idea that we have these preferences, and then as we mature, our family and our culture kind of enforce our already implanted preferences in our minds. And number three, as we spend more time doing what we prefer, we become more expert. We become better at it. And so these preferences even become more prevalent in our minds. Four, as we become more expert, we take on more challenges along the lines of our basic interests. So I would assume this would be around when you start playing sports, maybe.
Yeah, puberty, most likely.
Yeah, so where you kind of like, either some people get into comic books or sports or both, or people start playing instruments, kind of searching for your own identity. Number five, as we meet these challenges, our self-esteem rises and we become increasingly competent with those preferences. And so I can kind of already tell that this is just building on what starts as a child. And number six, we choose activities and careers that let us use our preferences. That's obviously, the career part is when you become adult. So maybe when you're in college, you kind of you go and say, well, I enjoy doing this and this and this. So let's be around people that enjoy that too. And I think there's no way you can counter that. That's a pretty straightforward thing. We all like to be around people who like things that we like. That's basic friendship. Number seven, we find that our preferences are not universal tools and begin to develop the other preferences where they are needed. And I think this is probably the most important one of these. And so I think it goes back to what I said about how I feel like I changed.
Right, being a basement dweller that has to go to the grocery store is a pretty rough transition. I can speak to that. So.
Right. But as you get out in the world and you start to discover that, I don't really like sitting in my house as much. I kind of want to have more friends. And so you say, well, maybe I'm not so extroverted, but I'd like to be. And so you start to change, and maybe that's why my test changed. Maybe I wanted to be more spontaneous, and that was the main one that changed. I used to be judging really hard, like planned everything, and so now maybe I want to be I don't want to have my whole life planned out for me right at the beginning. And then lastly, she says we become individuated people, true to our type, but able to take both attitudes and use all four functions as they are needed and appropriate. And again, that whole list was a direct quote from Mary H. McCulley's article. So yeah, I think that's actually really valid. As we grow up and we become our own person, we see in some situations, I might not need to say this joke or talk this way. Maybe I should approach this situation from a more planned perspective. One thing that's changing for me is my procrastination. I am a huge procrastinator, and in school, especially when you get into higher level, 500 level classes at a university, that's not the way you want to live life at all. And so I kind of see myself changing. What do you think about that last one?
Well, being the guy I am, the first thing that I thought of was, well, if as you get older, you tend to spread out and sort of normalize across the spectrum. What would happen if you lived forever? Would everyone just sort of become this wishy-washy sameness? I mean,
and I think that is a great way to conclude our show. a question of what if you live forever?
Let's ponder
this
that.
Yeah, let's think about that. All right, thank you guys for listening. It's been so much fun hanging out and talking today. Will you guys send us some stuff you want us to talk about? Send us an email at theinfiguryeffect.com. You can see that link in the show notes. Check us out on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. Follow us. Give us some feedback on what you want us to go from here. Thank you guys for listening. We'll see you next week.
Bye-bye, Internet.